Hello, it's New Year's Day. Happy New Year's 2022. It's also a balsamic moon in Capricorn, although that's not what I'm going to be talking today about today. I'm going to be doing a video on Jupiter in Pisces. Jupiter ingressed into Pisces December 29th. So it's been there for a few days already. And so I'm kind of well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm late with this one because Jupiter is going to be in Pisces until about May during this stretch of it. So we've got a good, whatever, 4 months or so, I guess. Five. I guess that's more like 5 months. But yeah, a good chunk of time. Jupiter will be in Pisces, so we'll be talking about Jupiter and Pisces for a while, so it's not just a quick little transit. Um, Although usually, Jupiter spends usually about a year in each sign, but this time it's kind of split up. We had the first little bit of Jupiter in Pisces last year during the summertime, and I don't know if any of my fan base, like people who follow my channel or whatever, have noticed, but I didn't do a video for Jupiter and Pisces last year. Um, and part of the reason for that was because basically I have certain associations with Jupiter and Pisces. I'm actually a Jupiter and Pisces native myself. And um, as you know, Jupiter is a planet that takes about 12 years to do a complete cycle of the whole zodiac. So if you want to look at last time Jupiter was in Pisces, we would subtract 12 years, bringing us to 2010. Um, and that year, it was like a very different time. I spent a whole year on a working holiday visa in Australia, and I don't know. I was a younger man back in those days, getting up to sort of wild young person antics. Um, and yeah, basically, you know, when I was anticipating Jupiter going to Pisces, there's such a strong association with last time Jupiter went to Pisces that I had a hard time having a fresh look at Jupiter in Pisces this year, a whole 12 years later, um, that I felt like I just had to like deal with I still had to deal with 2010. Uh, and I recorded a video. I said, "What the hell? I'll just record a video and talk about all that stuff." And I decided, I didn't really want to post it, and so I watched the video, deleted it, and then I proceeded to get really sick, and then ended up in the hospital later that summer. Um, Oh boy, but I don't have to get into all that now. But I mean, like, one of the things about if you look back 12 years ago, um, back then was it was right before Uranus ingressed into Aries, and then in 2011 we had the big earthquakes in Japan shortly after the Uranus ingress into Aries. Then we had 7 years of Uranus in Aries. Now Uranus is in Taurus, but in 2010 Uranus was in Pisces. So when Jupiter was in there, part of the energy we were dealing with was very different because it wasn't. I mean, if you're the kind of astrologer that uses modern planets, I mean, I guess if you're a hardcore traditionalist, this wouldn't be a factor. You'd just be looking at Jupiter and Pisces and whatever aspects. But if we do incorporate the modern planets, um, Jupiter's trip through Pisces was strongly influenced by its co presence and eventual conjunction with the planet Uranus. Now, Uranus stood for things like rebellion, breakthrough. It's kind of like I kind of see Uranus as like the prison break. There's a good um, Hafiz poem where he talks about the rowdy prisoners dropping keys all night for the rowdy prisoners to set them free. And I kind of feel like Jupiter in Pisces that year had very much that kind of vibe. And this year, Uranus is now in Taurus, squaring off against Saturn, which is a different kind of situation. Um, but I mean, we do. I guess you do get a nice like sextile at some point between Jupiter and Uranus, but it's not. It's not going to be as like as intense as a conjunction, because a conjunction is more of like a straight head-on confrontation where the two planets bump into each other in the same part of the sky, and um, conjunctions are usually talked about as a kind of a blending of the two planets together, whereas a sextile is not quite so strong of an aspect compared to that. Um, this year we have Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces. Um, and Neptune and Uranus are very different planets. Well, Uranus was all about this kind of liberating quality. Neptune, I don't know if it's an easy one to really sum up in a brief kind of statement, but my impression of Neptune is that it has more to do with kind of like visionary experiences, or some kind of like higher ideal, like the spiritual yearning for some sort of higher thing, or striving towards some higher ideal, or maybe even being kind of deluded when that if that ideal becomes a kind of a fantasy, it becomes detached from reality. um or being kind of like overcome by be kind of drunk. Neptune has this kind of drunk quality where you're like intoxicated by this, like being fascinated by this ideal or something like this, but you maybe kind of become drunk and intoxicated off of it in a certain way. Um, I mean, maybe Uranus has a quality like that too, or Uranus might want to like be liberated, get set free, and maybe there might be a kind of a celebratory quality with Uranus of breaking free from the bonds or something. Whereas Neptune seems a bit more like, you might dream that you're free from the bonds, but then wake up and you're still in them or something. It might be a kind of more of a elusive kind of experience. But I mean, that's one thing, anyways, that contrasts this year from 2010. Um, Another thing that contrasts it is that, well, while all this stuff is happening in Pisces, next door in Aquarius, and I guess also Capricorn. I mean, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but we're going to be having Venus for the first few months here is Venus retrograde, and then this Mars Saturn stuff. I kind of mentioned that a little bit in my last video I made. It's a little bit off topic, but I won't spend too much time on it. But there's um it's kind of interesting because there's some trouble going on with Venus related stuff, and the Jupiter stuff is a different kind of story, and eventually Venus will find her way into Pisces and then meet up. Well, I mean, I will do all that later. I'm kind of sorry if I'm a bit disorganized here. I'm just kind of I I kind of sketched out some ideas of what I could do for Jupiter and Pisces, and but I thought I'd just give a bit of a introduction about it before I dove into some of my more prepared material. Um, I thought, yeah, I'll just get into it more. But I've been talking about, you know, the whole thing about 2010 and me being a bit hung up on it, and then realizing, that it's not the same thing, because 2010 was a very Jupiter Uranus kind of year, and this is going to be more of a Jupiter Neptune year, which is quite different. And then when you factor in the other stuff going on, yeah, it's a bit of a different story. Um, but I don't know. You know what? There's some other points here that like I think I was having difficulty with it last year too because this is generally a positive transit, I would say, based on the fact that Jupiter is the greater benefic. It's a planet to do with good luck and good fortune and growth and expansion and stuff like that, and it's in its own domicile of Pisces. So it's a good thing for Jupiter. Um, it's kind of interesting. I find as an astrologer though, because in some way I sort of have some conflicts because I like astrology, but I kind of believe in this attitude that when you have too many expectations, you kind of start to sabotage your own happiness, right? It's like if there's what like it's a kind of a maybe a cliche or something. Maybe you've heard it before, but the idea that if you want to be happy, the best thing you can do is really have no expectations. So like we start a new year off like 2022, and heading into it, like a lot of people might expect that like with COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown, like maybe a lot of people are expecting we're not going to just like get out of it this year and they're kind of buckling in for another tough year or whatever, you know. Um, I figure if you weren't into astrology, maybe that's what a lot of people might be thinking. Who knows? Maybe even other terrible things might happen. I hope not. Um, But I mean, if you have something like astrology that gives you some sort of like foresight into being like that, this might actually be a good year, that there might actually be good things happening. And then especially like if you can sort of be like, oh well, I can use astrology to like compare it to what happened last time this planet was in this position, then you got a lot of expectations going, right? Like it's like depending on how your 2010 was, I mean, to for 2022 to compete with 2010 and being a good Jupiter and Pisces year, it's like it could be if you're not comparing it and you just look at a year like 2022 on its own without comparing it to other years of your life and just take it on its own terms without just see what comes of it, whether it's good or bad, and just take it as it comes without any expectation of what it should be, what it ought to be, what you hope to get out of it. And then, if good things come, then that's great, right? But it if you had a really good year, whatever, 12 years ago, and you're expecting like let's see if I can top it, let's say, oh, can I one up myself or whatever from my last Jupiter and Pisces. It's sort of like you kind of it's even if it's good, but if it's not as good as the other thing, then you're disappointed even though you had a pretty good year, right? Or like even if it's a bad year, it would in relatively seem all that much more worse if you were expecting to get something really good out of it. And for this reason, when I see a lot of astrologers, you know, being really positive, I don't know if I really even like really positive astrology, because it's, to be honest, like if somebody says like this is going to be a great month, everything's going to go well, and then you're like 3 weeks through the month and you're like, I haven't, where's the shit that's supposed to, it's like it would either maybe like, maybe you stop, you don't take the astrology so seriously. You're like, yeah, right, these people are just trying to like, make some money, or they're grifters, they're charlatans or something. Or they're trying to tell me a sweet story to get me to to butter me up so I pay them or something, right? Like you might become cynical or something like that. I don't know, but I think I'm just saying I had those kinds of obstacles because I was viewing this as being a kind of a positive thing, right? Um, but to actually talk about what Jupiter in Pisces is like, I had this idea. I mean, this is a pretty standard stuff. It's not that original, but I mean, if you're probably familiar with the whole idea of expansion and contraction, I was thinking, when I was younger, when I was in high school, I did a lot of art stuff. I was like an arty kid rather than being a serious academic. And I did the, photography course and the dark room and stuff like that. And, using old film cameras and things like this. I was more interested in photography when I was younger. I actually worked in a photo lab for a while, um, and did some photography related jobs. Um, but the nature of a camera is such that when you have a lot of light, um, you need to adjust the aperture of the camera. The aperture is it's like this hole that like contracts and opens, right? And basically, you contract when there's lots of light so that you don't overexpose your photograph and it's all bleached out or whatever. Um, and then when there is less light, you open up the aperture to allow more light to come into the lens. Our own, I mean, the human pupils, our eyes, work in a similar way where pupils dilate according to how much light there is. They will open and close. So, if we apply that idea to the planets of Jupiter and Saturn, you could say that Saturn is a closing or a restricting kind of thing, like closing the aperture to reduce the amount of light coming in, and that Jupiter has the effect of opening the aperture to open to allow more stuff to come in. Um, and I mean, I suppose you could also, if we move beyond just the metaphor of a camera or of an eye taking in light, it could also do with what you're putting out too. You could open it up and you could let out a lot of stuff, or you could close it and only let out a little bit, right? So, Jupiter, in the traditional scheme, all the planets, except for the sun and the moon, have two signs which they rule. One is a masculine sign and one is a feminine sign. So Pisces is the feminine or nocturnal or yin sign of Jupiter. And it's associated with the element water. It's a mutable sign. Now, water, as if you're at all familiar with astrology, is associated with your emotions primarily. And as such, I don't want to knock on people who have, water placements or a lot of water in their chart. But one thing I have noticed about the sign of Pisces and people who have strong Pisces placements, again, I mean, I don't know. No offense, don't take this the wrong way, don't take it too personally, but I find that Pisces has this thing of complaining. And actually, to some extent, I think all the water signs may be a little bit like this because of the emotional nature of water. It's sort of like can be this quality of being kind of sensitive, kind of easily put off, or the sort of like I don't like the emotional stuff. They're more poor. The emotional stuff is more gets through easier, right? Like um it's sort of like if you think about water, like if you were to like I don't know, pour something into a big tub of water, it's there's nothing going to keep that stuff that you, unless it's oil, like oil doesn't mix with water, right? But most things that you'd pour into water, like let's say you pour a cup of coffee into a big water cooler, the coffee's just going to mix right in. There's nothing like keeping it separate, right? It's kind of, and I think that, water people, are going to be more porous and sensitive to the world around them. They're going to be more feeling their emotions more strongly and stuff like this. Um, Now the thing is, Jupiter is like I said, a, if you take that aperture idea, has the effect of opening up the aperture to allow more light to come through. Um, and if we look at the signs that Jupiter rules, it rules Sagittarius and Pisces, which is interesting because, okay, Pisces. Okay, let me, all right, let's just rewind a little bit. Go back to Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the sign that comes at the very end of fall, and it's the beginning of winter. But the end of Sagittarius is the beginning of Capricorn, which is winter solstice, the darkest time of the year. So my metaphor works pretty well for Sagittarius, in that Sagittarius, in the darkest time of year, it works well. This image of using the opening of the aperture to start to let in more light to compensate for the fact that it's so dark. Um, and that kind of has something to do with the Sagittarius quality. So after Sagittarius, you get two traditionally Saturn ruled signs, which basically, Saturn is at home here because it's a dark time, but the Saturn ruled signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, aren't doing this thing of opening up and expanding and letting more light in. It isn't until you get to Pisces, you get another Jupiter ruled sign. That comes at the end of the winter, leading into spring equinox, the beginning of spring. And so there's a kind of like opening up in anticipation for the light that is going to come for the springtime. And so that sort of defines the kind of mood of Pisces, is that, in Sag, it's things are going like really dark, pitch black, and you really got to open them apertures up to get your night vision going and stuff like that to kind of compensate for the darkness. But in Pisces, it is getting lighter, and you're kind of like anticipating the return of the light and kind of opening up in that anticipation. But let me remind you, though, that Pisces is a water sign. It is emotional. And I think there's this one to sort of change subjects here. Like, before I spent so much time on astrology, I spent more time, what would you call it? Radical mental health circles, the whole spiritual emergence community. But when it comes to, let's say, mental health, I have never really been a fan of a lot of the language or the model that we use to understand mental health. And I'll I'll give you like an example of what I mean here, is that when it's really common, if a person is feeling lousy or whatever, to say that they're feeling depressed. Like the presence of a negative emotion, like someone's feeling sad, or maybe someone's complaining, or they're upset about things or whatever. Like, if you're not in a positive, cheery mood, we say that we're depressed. But as I understand it, depression is actually more like it's not really the presence of an emotion, but it's more of like the shutting down or the closing down of your ability to feel that emotion, which isn't, it's not actually really a bad thing necessarily, because it's like if you think about the image of a flower, when in the springtime, flowers, when it's during the day and the sun is out, this flower opens up. Again, it's sort of like this, the same metaphor of the opening of the aperture, right? The flower opens to take in the sun, and then when the sun isn't there, when it gets dark, the flower closes up, right? Um, and so if you were to like if we use the sort of like thing about the I don't know. I was going to say that if you open up in the winter, then like all you might get is a bunch of cold. But that's kind of what Sagittarius is doing. Is that it's like opening up to get what little bit of light is there, even at the darkest time of the year. That even if it's really dark, if you open that aperture, stick your camera on a tripod, leave the shutter open for a long time, you can take cool pictures even at night with very little light, right? Um, but I guess my point is I'm kind of taking a long way around of saying it, that the what there might it might be an emotional time with Jupiter and Pisces, because this is a water placement and we do have the opening up, right? It's not what I'm trying to get at is that Jupiter and Pisces may be associated with an emotional time in some way, but it's not like being depressed, being shut down, being numbed out, being feeling like you're dead inside. You know that thing where people are like, I'm just feel empty and dead and things are meaningless, and like that kind of like numb, like that's a kind of a Saturn quality, to be honest. Um and Jupiter is actually the opposite of that, which is rather than being closed down and feeling like cold and lifeless, it's you're starting to open up again. But it's like by opening up, then all the feelings kind of come out, and then I what I was saying earlier about Pisces maybe being the kind to complain or something, that like maybe in some situations it may not be so good to ruminate too much about our problems, or spend too much time complaining about things and when they're not changing, and you're just kind of getting yourself upset by beating your head against the wall or something like that with by thinking about it too much. But I would say that there is something different where it's like you've been there might be something that you've been holding back or you've been bottling up, and that the opening of the aperture that we're talking about with Jupiter is an opportunity where you're getting it off your chest. You have an opportunity to express yourself, and in that, even if it's not positive, like I don't know what everybody who watches my videos are like, but I think that you know like what are we talking about here, spirituality, I don't know, but I don't think that the answer to life is to try to make everything positive and eliminate the negative or exclude the negative. um that there's not actually not such a dichotomy where these things are so opposed to each other, but that they're mutually interconnected opposites, that the yin and the yang are both part of a continuous circle, that they're both connected and they both support each other, and that Pisces is a yin sign, right? um and it's not, I mean, it's not to say that Pisces, that yin is necessarily like inferior or lesser than or negative or bad, but the quality of yin and the quality of water is that emotional stuff, like often we don't like to, we try to avoid emotional stuff because it's like, it's, it's like heavy, it's like painful, or it's whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like the feelings are there. And I think that maybe, to compare it with some other water signs, Scorpio may be a little bit more defensive and protective about the feelings. Cancer, Cancer may be trying to secure a kind of sense of safety in what feels good or something like that. But I think, if anything, Pisces is about the catharsis, right? Like Pisces is about like opening up and letting go. It is, and then this is where it comes in, the mutable sign, right? It is a mutable sign, so it's all about changing, moving into the next thing. Um, which is, in Pisces, the sequence is Aries. It's the beginning of uh, of springtime. And Pisces is it's a transitional sign because it's mutable. It's a transition into a new season, and and so it sort of like comes at the end of a season, and at the end of things, like it's like, it's a good, it's an opportunity to sort of like all the weight you've been carrying around, to like get it off your shoulders, to lighten the load a bit before you get into the new season. And I don't know, like, I didn't want to talk too much about my whole year in Australia back 12 years ago, but I think there's certain things that I can identify this Pisces quality. Like, I mean, I remember the first week that I went to Australia, I was staying in a hostel. I mean, I'm going to tell two stories because they don't. I mean, one. Well, no, actually, screw telling two stories. I'm just going to focus in on the important part. The important part was that at some point in time, I remember in the very beginning of the trip, when I found myself in, the hostel, was at King's Cross in Sydney, Australia, just beginning my little leg of the journey. I felt like really emotional. I mean, like, there were certain things about that I would did was coming off the end of a breakup, and to be honest, like, I'm a Sagittarius, so I mean, it does kind of go well to maybe like to get over a breakup by going to the other side of the world or something. And but it wasn't just being still processing a breakup. It was more like that, this whole thing of like that, all this stuff of my past. What can I say? I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say here, but like, it's like, I don't know, that we are on the other side of the world, and you're far away from home where you're used to be. And it's, the 2010, it had that Uranus thing going on, right? So there was that, it was kind of like breaking out of jail, liberating, to be free, And but the Pisces thing came in, I feel like there's that kind of release, right? There's a bit of like, it's not just an emotional release, but it's kind of like, it's like when you come to the end of something, and the sense that something's behind you and you're moving on from it, and that you're, like, it was kind of like the very start of a whole year in Australia. So it was at the kind of like the beginning of spring, the beginning of a new thing. But I don't like it's hard for me to put into words because it wasn't just like, oh, like I'm going to miss my family or people back in Vancouver, or I'm going to miss Canada, or that it's like scary being so far away from home. It's like, I mean, like maybe some of those feelings were there, but it was just, this is kind of like, I don't know. Maybe I don't even sure what I'm trying to express here, but I don't know if anybody else has ever gone traveling or gone away from home or done something different where you're, and then having this sort of like, just as you're stepping into this big new thing, like a lot of the emotions coming up, right? Like I kind of like, that's what I associate with Jupiter and Pisces in my experience. I don't know. These are just this is my beginning video, anyways. I might do. I have an idea to make a few more of these to sort of get an idea of what the Jupiter and Pisces vibe is all about. But this is my first crack at it, anyways. Um, you can tune back in. I'm probably going to be doing. I'm thinking it might be useful to do one of those videos where you do go through the 12 signs and you do, you look at it like a horoscope for each of the 12 zodiac signs. You can go off your rising sign or sun sign. I might do one of those. Um, I was also thinking about looking at some Jupiter and Pisces characters, like some people where Jupiter, it's not really a personal planet to have Jupiter and Pisces, but if it's placed, in a certain ways, like if it's aspecting the sun or the moon or on the ascendant, then it can have a much more personal kind of influence, right? So I was thinking about looking at some kind of celebrity or famous examples of people who have a kind of a personalized Jupiter and Pisces that are really like Jupiter and Pisces people to get a feel for it. Um, so I might be doing a bit of that. But I don't know. I I hope I managed to like get that across my whole thing about setting off on a trip, because I feel like kind of at a loss for words to kind of like communicate the exact kind of feeling, but it's like that transition, right? Is that you're like, maybe that's what I'm going for with that mutable thing. It's like you're when that the emotion of your being in between two things, right? Where you're like stepping into something else, but you're still in the process of saying goodbye to that other thing before you step into that next thing. And so there's a kind of a sentimentality to Pisces of that kind of like goodbye to whatever it is that you're like stepping away from, and that you might be excited, or there might be a kind of good Jupiter sense of adventure to whatever's on the horizon. But it's like adventure, but there's a kind of like teary eyedness, sentimentality. It's a bit like, also, I mean, I'm thinking of almost like Lord of the Rings now, where the first Lord of the Rings, where the two hobbits are like, wait, this is the farthest I've been outside the Shire before, right? Like that's actually a good Jupiter and Pisces moment, right? Because I think Jupiter has the quality of like adventure, you know, and it's like there's this kind of like you're at this threshold where you're like adventuring beyond. This is the point where I was comfortable, where I was familiar, where I was in my comfort zone, and I'm saying goodbye to my comfort zone, and I'm, the sentimentality of all the stuff that you're comfortable and familiar with, that you're saying goodbye to. And and that but that's in the name of, it's not like oh, it's not the same as the kind of grief that would be associated with Saturn. As it doesn't mean, like, I mean, if you take Lord of the Rings, for example, the hobbits actually go back to, the Shire. The thing bad happens to the Shire. The Shire is there. It's not. They're most of the hobbits are kind of blissfully unaware of all this drama going on in the rest of the Middle Earth. It's not like Saturn would be more of like a firm ending, or like the actual death of something. So it's not nearly like the same as a death, but it's more about like adventuring on past what you're familiar with. And the whole host of emotions that come up with that. I think that's a good example of Jupiter in Pisces. And that's great because I didn't even think of that one going into this video. I just kind of thought about it as I'm trying to wrap up here. So, okay, we're at about 40 minutes now. Hopefully I did a good job. I will try to continue making these astrology videos. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Okay.